I was at a dinner party recently, watching a couple I've known for years. The husband is a high-level executive, sharp, articulate, the kind of person you'd instinctively trust to lead a company through a crisis. He was holding the room's attention, telling the story with an effortless, practiced grace. But then his wife made a small, playful joke, something totally minor about him forgetting a grocery list.
Okay.
It was harmless banter, the kind that usually invites a quick laugh. Instead, the atmosphere at the table it shifted instantly.
Oh.
He didn't snap, he didn't argue, he just vanished. His face went completely blank, the shutters down look that turned his eyes cold. For the rest of the night, he didn't say another word to her. He was physically there, passing the wine and nodding to guests, but he had retreated into this fortress of silence so thick you could practically feel a temperature drop. When I caught him alone later and asked if he was all right, he didn't give me some deep reflection or an apology.
What did he say?
He just shrugged and said, "That's just how I am. If people push me, I shut down." And it was just a chillingly simple sentence. Here was a man capable of navigating complex global markets, yet he was completely paralyzed by a moment of minor frustration.
That phrase, "that's just how I am," it's like a bunker, isn't it?
It is. It's a bunker phrase. And that instantaneous shift from composed leader to a person hiding behind that phrase, it left me wondering about the invisible scripts we all carry. We mistake these behaviors for personality quirks, but they feel like something much more corrosive.
I think they are. Emotional immaturity in adults doesn't always look like a temper tantrum. More often, it's this quiet, sophisticated avoidance. It's the art of making the other person responsible for the very air they breathe.
Which raises this haunting question, right? Why do so many of us reach these professional and intellectual heights, yet remain stuck in the emotional basement using silence, and that's just me, as weapons to keep the world at bay?
And that's exactly what we're going to get into today. We are going on a deep dive to analyze that precise phenomenon, the emotional withdrawal or the shutdown response that so often masks as just a personality trait.
So we're looking past just the individual failure of this one executive and examining the systems that created him, things like the evolutionary mismatch between our old tribal brains and modern life.
Exactly. We're going to unpack this behavior by connecting it to 4 powerful underlying forces that suggest this is not just a personal failure, but really a failure of the systems we live in. Our mission is to give you the full picture of this silent crisis.
Okay, 4 forces. Where do we start?
We'll start by distinguishing between necessary self-preservation and manipulative withdrawal, what we can call the crisis of silence. Then we'll explore that evolutionary mismatch you just mentioned, how our ancient psychology conflicts with the modern world.
And that triggers these primitive defenses.
Right. Then we'll look at the sociological vacuum, how the decay of community and formal maturation processes leaves adults emotionally vulnerable. And finally, we'll see how all of this collides in what we're calling the digital crucible.
The dating market.
Specifically, how the modern dating market can exacerbate this loneliness and immaturity, turning emotional isolation into a genuine public health concern.
That sets up a truly fascinating arc. The idea that a simple shutdown response can be a symptom of a massive systemic failure, that's powerful. So let's unpack this crisis of silence first. When is that shutdown a justified defense, and when does it slide into, abusive manipulation? Because for the person on the receiving end, it feels like punishment either way.
You're hitting on the fundamental tension.
Okay.
And what we're seeing is that this is not a clear-cut issue. It really operates on a spectrum, and it's defined largely by intent and context. And maybe most importantly, by the communication that surrounds the silence.
So it's the difference between needing a timeout to cool down and deliberately punishing the other person. How do you even draw a line between those two things?
The crucial line is really in how it's executed. Let's look at the dark end of that spectrum first, what we'd call the intentional silent treatment, or stonewalling. This is defined as an abusive tactic designed purely to gain control, to manipulate an outcome, or to actively punish someone.
So that's a calculated kind of a protracted withdrawal of dialogue. It's not just for a few minutes.
No, it's not. This deliberate use of ignoring someone is actually a form of emotional abuse, specifically neglect. The key markers are that the silence is open-ended, it carries this implicit demand that the other person has to fix things, and it's sustained long after the immediate conflict is over.
Right, and the goal is to make the partner feel unstable and desperate for re-engagement, so you gain leverage.
Precisely. The recipient is left in this state of self-doubt and heightened anxiety, which is exactly the point.
So, If the executive in my story went silent for the rest of the night without a single explanatory word, that moves it far, far closer to stonewalling. He's forcing his wife to feel responsible for fixing the mood in the room.
Absolutely. But now we have to contrast that with what we'd call pure self-preservation or shutdown. This is what happens when someone feels they are genuinely unable to communicate constructively.
And what's that look like?
It's when they perceive that their attempts at healthy communication, expressing a boundary, stating their perspective, are just met with relentless hostility, or their words are being twisted, or the other person is just arguing in bad faith.
I think we've all felt that. When you're in a conflict and you feel like you're just not being heard or you're being dismissed, that feeling is deeply, deeply exhausting.
It's psychologically painful. And in those instances, the silence becomes a last resort. The person feels exhausted and disgusted, and they conclude that their perspective just doesn't matter. Continuing to speak is only going to cause more harm to themselves.
So they retreat to a safe space.
They do. But the difference is that in true self-preservation, the silence is a retreat to heal and reflect, not a tactic to control and punish.
That framing is so important, especially when we look at, say, the male perspective that's often represented. The rationale for retreat is sometimes framed very functionally, almost like a cost-benefit analysis.
Yes, like talking offers no return on investment. For many, stopping the conversation is seen as justified when they perceive their partner as hateful and uncompromising.
Or when they just realize it's going to be another useless escalating argument that ends with both people saying things they regret.
Exactly. They look at the history of the conflict and see the same issues coming up over and over again. If they already know where it's leading, they just opt for quiet. One viewpoint that came up was just following the rule. If you don't have anything constructive to say, don't say anything at all.
And for some, the silence is genuinely about processing, right? It's an internal mechanism that just happens to look like withdrawal from the outside.
That's a core theme. The need to process. Many who retreat will admit they just suck at communicating in the heat of the moment, especially under emotional stress. They need time to think it over for a bit to get the words I actually mean.
So they avoid saying something they don't intend, which would only make the situation worse. The goal is clarity, not punishment.
Right.
But okay, even if the executive in my story genuinely couldn't articulate his frustration without being destructive, it still feels terribly hurtful to his wife, who's left in the dark just wondering, what on earth did I do wrong?
And that takes us into the gray area, reactive silence. It's a mechanism that's triggered by feeling ignored or dismissed, but it can quickly morph into a deliberate disengagement that carries a punitive weight.
How so?
Some individuals who are driven to this point will intentionally hold out significantly more than most people until the other party shows a genuine attempt at diplomacy. They're demanding the other person bridge the gap first.
Okay, now that sounds manipulative again, even if it started as a defense. If you are deliberately withholding conversation until the other person submits and apologizes, you're using silence as a weapon, regardless of who started it.
The intent has shifted. It's gone from defense to control. And that is exactly why the discussion has to pivot from internal motivation to demanding external clarity and maturity.
The adult requirement.
That's the measure.
Yeah.
Regardless of the internal motivation, be it self-preservation, processing, or a punitive reaction, the failure to articulate the need for space is the universal failure of emotional maturity here.
Adults in relationships shouldn't act like children who just disappear into a sulk.
Exactly. If you need time to step away and reflect, you state that boundary clearly and constructively. You have to include a time limit or at least a promise to return to the subject. For instance, I am feeling overwhelmed. I need 30 minutes alone, and then we will talk about this.
That sets a boundary, but it also creates an environment of emotional safety. You know they're coming back.
Precisely. If instead you just sulk or stonewall without explanation, you're creating emotional chaos. A sustained refusal to engage on important issues without any explanation it's just toxic behavior. And it's often rooted in an inability to manage one's own emotional discomfort, which is, by definition, immaturity.
So the adult shifts from, that's just how I am, to, I am actively working on articulating my need for space.
That's the real measure, isn't it? Are you creating emotional safety with a time-bound, collaborative boundary? Or are you creating emotional chaos with an open-ended punishment? The second we jump from, I need time to think, to just blanking someone for the rest of the night, we've shifted frames entirely.
And that takes us to the core psychological failure, which brings us to the next big question, why? Why do highly successful, competent adults like my executive friend revert to such primitive, binary, self-defeating defenses? If they can run a company, why can't they handle a joke?
And the answer, I think, lies in this concept of evolutionary mismatch.
Okay, let's unpack this. Evolutionary mismatch. It sounds like our psychological software is lagging dangerously behind the hardware updates of the modern world.
That's a really good analogy. The term for that lag is the speed problem. Mismatch theory basically posits a state of disequilibrium. You have a specific psychological trait, let's call it T, that evolved in an ancestral environment. E1 thinks small-scale hunter-gatherer societies.
So thousands of years ago.
Right. And that trait was highly adaptive back then. It helped with survival and reproduction. But when you place that same trait, T, into our drastically novel current environment, E2, our industrialized digital world, it becomes harmful, detrimental.
So the environment just changed way too fast for our psychology to catch up.
That's the adaptive lag, exactly. Our basic psychological mechanisms are still running on their ancient code. They take in specific E1 environmental cues, process them, and produce what should be adaptive behaviors. But because the inputs in E2 have changed so drastically in quantity and intensity, the same mechanism now produces maladaptive outputs.
We all know the classic physiological example, right? Our ancient love of sugar and fat, which was great when food was scarce, becomes catastrophic in a world with a fast food restaurant on every corner.
Perfect example. And there are psychological ones too. Think about novelty seeking. In E1, seeking out new territory might have led to finding new resources. In E2, that same mechanism gets hijacked by technology, leading to compulsive social media scrolling and an addiction to stimulus that just undermines deep focus.
Or our fear of social exclusion. Being kicked out of the tribe in E1 meant death.
A death sentence.
Yeah.
In E2, that same fear gets triggered by 1,000 anonymous online insults or a lack of likes on a post, leading to debilitating anxiety, even though there's zero physical danger.
The mechanism is perfect, but the input is corrupted. So let's apply this adaptive lag to emotional withdrawal. How does the shutdown response connect to our ancestral environment?
We have to hypothesize a bit about the ancestral value of withdrawal. In those small, tight-knit tribal groups, social conflict was inevitable, but it was also incredibly dangerous. Ostracization or violence could mean death.
Right.
So a rapid internal shutdown response, that instant emotional freeze, the face going blank, might have been a very quick, almost automatic strategy to de-escalate potential violence or exile.
So it was about signaling submission, like, I'm not a threat, the fight is over.
That's one strong possibility. It signals to a dominant individual that you're not contesting their status. Another function could be just preserving mental resources. Conflict is stressful. It's energy intensive. Shutting down might have been a way to conserve cortisol and physiological energy when a situation was deemed unwinnable. You survive the immediate encounter and reassess later.
So in E1, silence was a rapid, involuntary survival mechanism. It protected your life and maybe the group's cohesion. It was protective.
Exactly. But now let's look at the modern detriment in E2. We live in a world of intimate, pair-bonded relationships. Our survival depends not on tribal submission, but on emotional vulnerability and complex verbal communication.
The threat isn't group exile anymore. It's relational failure.
Precisely. And in this E2 setting, that same rapid shutdown is no longer adaptive. It causes severe relational distress, it gets labeled as abusive neglect, and it directly undercuts the individual's ability to form healthy attachments.
So the executive's instinctual flight response, if people push me, I shut down, is a relic. It's a mechanism designed to survive an assault from a rival tribe member, not a minor social discomfort from his wife over dessert. The mechanism is working perfectly according to its ancient code, but the code is catastrophic in a modern relationship.
That's the core of the mismatch. It's not that he's a bad person, it's that his best evolutionary tool is now his greatest liability. And because this isn't just an individual failure, addressing these traits often requires changing the environment itself.
That makes so much sense. You can't just tell someone to try harder when they're fighting a million years of wiring. You have to change the rules of the game. What are the general strategies for dealing with these mismatches?
Well, the material suggests 3 general strategies that go beyond just relying on willpower, which is often the least reliable approach because these ancient mechanisms are just so powerful.
Okay, so 3 systematic ways to fix our mismatched brains. What's the first one?
The first strategy is to add options. You create a preferred constructive option, let's call it C, that is designed to be more rewarding or have less friction than the maladaptive option, A. Think of building protected bike lanes instead of just telling people not to drive their cars.
Okay, so applied to our executive.
It means creating a constructive, low-friction path for him to express frustration that's preferable to the silent treatment. For instance, creating a relationship ritual where, at the first sign of emotional flooding, he says a pre-agreed phrase, "I'm invoking my 5-minute rule."
And then what?
Then he immediately goes to a pre-designated cool-down zone. Not to sulk, but specifically to write down 3 feelings before he comes back. This ritualized communication, C, becomes a preferred, easily accessible option over the bad option, A, of total unexplained withdrawal.
That removes the ambiguity and the punitive feel. It replaces it with a concrete action. What about the second strategy?
The second is to remove options. You remove the bad option or structure the environment to prevent it. We see this in behavioral economics with mast strapping. From Odysseus tying himself to the mast to resist the siren's call.
Binding yourself to a constructive path by removing the possibility of self-sabotage.
Exactly, like removing all the junk food from your house. In the context of emotional conflict, this might mean structuring the environment to remove the avenues for bad faith arguments. Maybe agreeing that only "I feel" statements are allowed, or having a rule to pause any argument that hits a certain volume.
So you remove the inputs that trigger the shutdown response in the first place.
You make the shutdown response unnecessary. And the third strategy is to alter the organism. This is direct intervention to change the individual's preference or capability. Think of behavioral therapy, intentional training, or even certain medications. This is where sustained conscious effort and willpower come into play.
But you said that's often the least reliable approach.
It often is, compared to changing the external environment or the options. You're literally trying to rewire an ancient mechanism through sheer conscious effort, day after day. It's a heavy lift.
It sounds like our best bet is to proactively change the environment and provide structured, preferable options. But that brings us to the next big question. Why did the executive never get the emotional training to use these preferable options in the first place? Where did the environment, sociologically go wrong?
The current environment, our E2, that exacerbates this mismatch isn't just modern, it's highly fragmented. Your executive friend is a high-achieving social atom. The root sociological issue is the rise of social atomism, which leaves individuals isolated and lacking the social training required for emotional competence.
So if mismatch explains why he has this relic trait, the sociological vacuum explains why he never learned to override it. Is that right?
That is the perfect link. Social atomism is this idea that society is just an aggregate of self-interested, self-sufficient individuals, all operating as separate atoms. The individual is the only true object of concern, kind of divorced from any necessary interdependence.
That idea has dominated Western thought for centuries.
It has. Theorists like Locke and Hobbes asserted that these rational, self-interested atoms must sacrifice a tiny bit of freedom to form a social contract for mutual preservation. But the core value is always independence. Critics argue this fundamentally misunderstands human nature.
How so?
By treating individuals as interchangeable molecules in a bucket of water, atomism introduces this harsh and brutal equality and fails to recognize our inherent uniqueness and, more importantly, our relational needs.
So when the whole social structure prioritizes the independent, self-interested atom over the collective, what happens to people psychologically?
It leads directly to a kind of psychological breakdown. Sociologist Philip Selznick described how atomization results in social disintegration. The breaking down of tight-knit communities, shared norms, strong institutions. This creates what he called the mass man, individuals who are homogeneous, amorphous, because their identity isn't defined by deep, specific community roles.
And how does that connect to emotional maturity?
Well, this psychological atomization means that old behavioral norms become obsolete. Without external guidance or strong, consistent social feedback, these individuals foster irrational emotional acts. Or in our case, they revert to primitive, binary emotional responses. When you're a disconnected atom, you lack the shared script, the social feedback, the mooring required for mature emotional regulation. You only have yourself.
And what would have provided that mooring historically? The formal processes of transitioning from a self-interested child to a mature, community-oriented adult.
You mean rites of passage. The erosion of these rites of passage, or ROPs, is the sociological vacuum that leaves so many successful adults emotionally deficient. Traditionally, ROPs were community-created and community-directed experiences. They were designed to guide an individual's transition to a new status, a public marker of adulthood, while transmitting essential cultural values.
we really lack those in modern American society. We have these arbitrary markers. You can drive at 16, vote at 18, drink at 21, but they're completely disconnected from actual emotional competence or social responsibility.
That is the modern ambiguity. Without clearly established ROPs, young people are left unclear about when and how they actually become an adult.
Yeah.
And in that vacuum, they're forced to create their own marker events based on peer or media values, which are often destructive binge drinking, drug use, as a desperate attempt to seek public validation of their adult status.
They're trying to create the ordeal that traditional societies provided, but without any of the guidance or intentional ethical training.
And so we're sending these psychologically atomized individuals, brilliant in their careers, perhaps into adulthood, without the emotional tools to deal with complexity.
So we need to know what those ROPs actually taught that our executive friend is missing. What were the essential elements that compelled emotional maturity?
The sources outline 4 structural elements of traditional ROPs that are critical for fostering emotional competence, and they're exactly what we see lacking in that quiet shutdown response.
Okay, let's start with the foundation.
Community values and ethics. The community had to agree on the essential values and behaviors like commitment to service, family duty that they wanted to convey. ROPs were the mechanisms for internalizing those values. If the community is atomized, there are no shared values to internalize beyond individual achievement.
Which is what the executive has mastered. But he struggles with the non-transactional value of relational intimacy.
Precisely. The second element is the complete antithesis of our comfortable modern life: adversity or personal challenge.
The ordeal.
Traditional ROPs purposely included experiences that challenged the individual emotionally and physically. These ordeals were designed to push the young person to their limit, forcing them to experience a full range of human emotions and potential, building the psychological resilience needed to handle conflict and discomfort without immediately retreating.
But wait, in a society so dedicated to safetyism, isn't recommending ordeals a bit dangerous? Where's the line between a necessary challenge and just trauma?
The line is drawn by intention and support. Traditional ordeals were structured, supervised, and had a clear purpose recognized by the community, often followed by integration and celebration. The goal was resilience, not harm. Contrast that with modern adversity, which is often random, meaningless, and unsupported.
Like being bullied online.
Exactly. The executive in your story clearly missed the training that says minor discomfort is normal and requires engagement, not flight. His adversity trigger is a playful joke.
That makes the failure of maturation so clear. What's the third missing element?
This one is maybe the most profound in our age: silence and reflection. Youth today grow up immersed in a cacophony of sound, of mediated togetherness, cell phones, video games, social feeds. ROPs intentionally set aside prolonged periods of time alone for reflection.
That kind of enforced quiet is completely foreign to us now.
It is. This silence develops an internal dialogue, the ability to narrate one's own feelings, to process events, to make sense of the world. It builds self-awareness. Without that internal practice, the moment a relational stressor hits, the individual have no internal mechanism to cope other than the primitive shutdown.
They haven't practiced the internal speech required to say, I am frustrated because I feel disrespected and I need a moment.
They can't hear their own processing mechanism because the environment is too loud. And finally, the fourth element: giving away previous behaviors. ROPs included a symbolic act of shedding childish behaviors and attitudes. This act conveyed the reality that transition requires intentionally leaving something dear, the comfort of your responsibility in the past.
And the emotionally immature adult is the one who refuses to perform that symbolic giveaway.
They hold on to those childish attitudes and pull them out as a defense. That's just how I am. Bunker phrase is the ultimate refusal to give away childish emotional reactivity.
So this sociological vacuum, the lack of shared values, structured challenges, enforced quiet, and separation from childishness, is the perfect storm that leaves the mismatched, evolutionarily programmed individual vulnerable to these emotional shutdowns. The systems failed him, which I guess brings us to what happens when that fragile individual is put into the ultimate stress test environment of the modern world.
The digital crucible. When these mismatched, atomized individuals, especially young adults seeking intimacy, enter the modern dating landscape, the stress is just amplified exponentially. This is where we have to look at how biological determinism dictates that high-value men must master emotional regulation to navigate the brutal supply and demand of digital dating.
This is where it all collides. Let's look at how the profit motive warps the search for human connection and fuels the kind of anxiety that leads to emotional withdrawal.
We have to understand the fundamental shift in the business model of dating apps. They've evolved. Their focus shifted from facilitating successful offline encounters to maximizing match accumulation and, critically, subscriber retention. Success for the user is a failure for the platform's bottom line.
They profit from keeping you perpetually searching, not from you finding a successful long-term relationship.
Exactly. It's described as the casino model, gamification. The apps use highly sophisticated psychological strategies to maximize addictive behavior, often on a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, just like a slot machine.
The match has to be just high enough and unpredictable enough to keep you hooked, to keep you pulling the lever.
Right. But the reward can't be so high that you actually find a partner and leave the platform, because then they lose a customer.
That creates a deeply perverse financial incentive. If success means losing a paying subscriber, they're incentivized to maintain failure just below the threshold of total frustration. How does that play out in the user experience?
This is where algorithmic throttling comes in. Since men are the largest group of paid subscribers, they're seeking an advantage in a crowded market, and they're statistically more likely to quit if they find a partner. Sophisticated AI tools are likely deployed to maximize that subscriber revenue.
So they'll throttle your visibility or limit the quality of matches you see as a free user.
And then push pay-for-advantage models like boosted profiles that keep paying customers engaged by offering these limited temporary bits of priority access.
So the user is literally paying to have their dating experience slightly less throttled. That sounds exhausting and psychologically damaging. And how does this manufactured scarcity affect men and women differently?
There is a profound gender disparity in this digital marketplace that impacts mental health in huge ways. The experiences are almost mirror opposites.
Let's start with the women's experience.
Women generally report being inundated with matches, often too many to process, leading to choice paralysis and just reduced effort in communication. For many, the platform becomes primarily a source of validation, gratification, a boost in self-worth.
They're accumulating matches as a replacement for actual intimacy.
Yes, they get this super stimulus reward from social acceptance and approval, often with more than half of users reporting they don't even go on in-person dates, or only rarely. Their difficulty is sifting through the sheer abundance.
So they get the hyper-validation signal, the match notification, without the emotional work of a real relationship. That's a mismatch in itself.
Whereas men are on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. They receive very few responses. They face extremely low acceptance rates. This drives them to purchase extremely low acceptance rates. This drives them to purchase expensive paid features just to get limited priority.
And the data shows something like 80% of first messages are sent by men.
That's right, with significantly lower female response rates, particularly from highly attractive women who are able to buy the platform to be extremely choosy.
This sounds like a public health time bomb. You have a huge population of young, productive men being subjected to constant low-level algorithmic rejection that's designed to maximize profit.
That is the urgent concern, and it's labeled as such. This environment is causing excessive harm to the psychological profiles of a large number of men. There's evidence directly linking dating app use, the frequency and length of use, to higher rates of depression and anxiety, especially in men facing those low acceptance rates.
That continuous digital rejection taps directly into that ancient evolutionary fear of social exclusion we talked about, but it's happening thousands of times over.
And that's the downward spiral. Symptoms of depression and anxiety triggered by the frustration of the app, that feeling of failure, can then impact their social skills and motivation offline, making it even more difficult to form healthy relationships.
So it's a feedback loop.
It's a downward spiral in the populace. This psychological impact on young men is deemed an urgent public health problem that might require regulatory action against things like throttling and pay-for-advantage models. If action isn't taken, we face a population of young men who just grow weary and withdrawn from the entire process.
So the apps, instead of solving loneliness, are actively gamifying and weaponizing our psychological vulnerabilities. They're breeding the very loneliness and emotional volatility we started this whole deep dive talking about.
And if we look at this through the evolutionary lens one last time, we see how the digital market just amplifies these existing dynamics to create the ultimate mismatch scenario.
The evolutionary dynamics amplified by the digital marketplace.
Right. The digital format doesn't create new preferences. It amplifies pre-existing sexual selection preferences from our E1 past. Sexual selection theory predicts women prefer mates with resources, status, and investment capacity. Men tend to prefer physical attractiveness, an indicator of fertility.
And the digital marketplace makes those preferences instantly searchable and global.
So high-value individuals, as measured by those evolved preferences, become significantly more choosy because their options feel limitless. This increases the competition for everyone else exponentially.
And the high male demand isn't purely biological, is it? There's a cultural component.
That's right. While there is an ancient male strategy for seeking mate quantity, the high demand is also rooted in a cultural phenomenon where women may collectively restrict male sexual access to maximize the value exchanged for sex. Cultural forces can make women feel uncomfortable openly showing sexual interest, which further obscures the market and compounds the frustration men feel.
And finally, the very tool we're using, the smartphone itself, is a mismatch.
Indeed. Smartphones and the apps they host hijack our evolved predispositions for social bonding. They're highly correlated with increased jealousy, anxiety, and fragmented attention. The technology itself further complicates the human search for genuine, intimate connection, making the modern quest for love a fundamentally mismatched and emotionally overwhelming experience for the atomized, untrained adult.
We started with a highly functional executive whose emotional mechanism instantly reverted to shutting down when faced with a minor relational stressor.
What we see when we connect all these pieces is that his personalized defense mechanism, that quiet, sophisticated avoidance, is not merely a quirk. It is a failure state dictated by an evolutionary blueprint that is hopelessly mismatched to the modern environment of intimacy. He's an atomized individual divorced from the community structures like rites of passage that should have provided the essential training, the adversity, and the silence needed to mature his emotional responses and learn to give away childish behaviors. When faced with the intense, gamified social pressure of modern intimacy, the default setting is withdrawal. The external success he achieved masks an internal deficiency, a relic of a past adaptation that, in this atomized digital age, becomes corrosive to his relationship and his own well-being, leading directly to the loneliness, depression, and anxiety that is now a critical public health concern.